The British are coming. The British are coming. Those words sounded the warning in the towns west of Boston that British troops were on the march. Citizens turned soldiers came to Lexington Green, and the bridge it conquered. And the first shots of the American Revolution were fired on April 19, 1775. The British are coming. Surely those same words were heard along the great path of war that once was the Champlain Corridor. They must have been shouted in fateful 1776 as a British army was forming in Canada to invade the upstart land to the south. The Champlain Corridor. The St. Lawrence River comes in, Quebec up here, and Montreal, and then the Richelieu River comes down and ties into Lake Champlain. Very rough map here. Champlain narrows down here and ends. Here's Fort Ty right here. Fort Ticonderoga. Around here, over here, Mount Independence. Gainsborough right here, Whitehall. And then Lake George. Most armies attempting to conquer the Champlain Corridor would come to Ticonderoga, jump over to Lake George, go 30 miles south on the lake, and then take about a 15-mile trail down to the Hudson River. And the Hudson they'd connect with here, and the Hudson goes all the way down to Albany and New York City, the Champlain Corridor. That's what we're going to be talking about all day today. Along Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson River, the fate of the world in some ways lay at stake in the fateful days a quarter of a millennium ago. Before peace came again, the poetic place names of Ticonderoga, Hubbardton, Bennington, Saratoga would be writ large on the ever-turning pages of history. The mighty year of 1775 was, of course, 250 years ago this year. On May 10th, less than a month after Lexington had conquered, 83 men under Vermont's Ethan Allen and a military genius from Connecticut named Benedict Arnold assembled at Champlain's Hands Cove. In the darkness, they quietly and nervously rowed to the New York side, and before dawn seized the famed British-held Fort Ticonderoga without a struggle. A day later, the also prominent fort at Crown Point, 12 miles north, fell to Vermont's Seth Warner. More than 120 cannon were captured from the two forts, most from Crown Point, and many of them would be hauled over the next winter's snow to Boston, to Washington, to drive the British out of Boston. Come 1776, Ticonderoga remained in American possession, and the number of troops there grew after a failed American attempt to capture Quebec City. The defeated Americans, including a large force under Benedict Arnold, retreated to Ticonderoga. Arnold, he's unbelievable. Arnold promptly set about building an American fleet on Champlain. Word from the north held that an army of British under the governor of Canada, Guy Carleton, was preparing an invasion south up the Champlain Corridor. You always it gets confusing, south up the Champlain Corridor. You see Champlain flows north, the Richelieu flows north, you know, down up. Yes. Meanwhile, at Ticonderoga, American commander Anthony Wayne, the famous Mad Anthony Wayne for a time commanded there, was gathering troops to face an expected attack, 1776. And he fortified, not only improved the fort's defenses, but he fortified a peninsula on the Vermont shore, a half a mile away. It was called Rattlesnake Point, but the Americans renamed it Mount Independence. It's a great park today, wonderful ruins there. And soon 10,000 troops manned Ticonderoga and Independence. It was early October, snow on the high Adirondacks, when the British fleet sailed south in advance of a 7,000-man army. Lurking behind Valcour Island just off Plattsburgh was Arnold and his new fleet. The morning of October 11th, the British warships swung around the southern tip of Valcour and opened fire. After a day-long fight, the British had a decided edge over the Americans and were ready to complete victory in the morning. But Arnold snuck away in the night, and some of his fleet escaped. Carleton now brought his army past undefended Crown Point to Ticonderoga, Independence. But on approach, the Canadian governor saw flags flying over new fortifications and more troops than he commanded. 10,000 Americans, well armed and ready. Carleton took a long look and turned around and went back to Canada. 1706 was all over with. Today we view Lake Champlain as one of the world's beauty spots. Wide waters bordered by green fields, framed by ancient mountains. The wonderful historian Richard Ketchum, who I was privileged to know, wrote, "The Hudson-Champlain Passage was the continent's chief strategic military thoroughfare, and in 1776 it pointed like a long, vengeful sword at the heart of the renegade American colonies." You know, we live right at the edge of this war zone. I mean, all that was happening just over that ridge over there, over the Green Mountains. It could easily have come this way. The Champlain Corridor, running from the St. Lawrence River along the Richelieu to Champlain, then via Lake George, then the Hudson River, had become the most important military route in all the world. Guy Carleton had been planning a second try on the Champlain route. But a British general with powerful London ties had other ideas. His name was John Burgoyne, and he told the king of his plans for winning the war. He would attack along the Champlain Corridor with a large army, including German mercenaries and Indians, while another British army advanced north up the Hudson from New York City, and still another army marched from the west along the Mohawk Valley, all to meet at Albany. The result would be cutting off New England from the rest of the rebellious colonies. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, as he was known, had fought at Bunker Hill, and then against the American invasion of Canada in 1776. He was a well-known London personality, member of Parliament, indeed a well-known playwright and actor. He went to England in the winter of 76 and 77 and not only sold his plan to the higher-ups, including the king, but returned with orders to replace Carleton in leading the 77 campaign. He's an operator. By spring, Burgoyne was ready with an army of 8,000, almost half of them hired soldiers, mercenaries, Germans. To get technical, they were really Brunswickers and Hesse-Hanau's, often called Hessians. We'll simplify it. We're just going to call them Germans. Also, 500 Indians coming from miles and miles would join Burgoyne. In early July, Burgoyne landed troops near Ticonderoga. There, the Americans, now commanded by a veteran named Arthur Sinclair, numbered only about 3,500 men. A lot of them had gone home, or a lot of them had gone to help Washington down to the south. Far too many to properly defend Ticonderoga independence. And Sinclair denied advice that he fortify a steep hill that rose right over Ticonderoga called Mount Defiance. He believed it was too steep to take cannon up there. One British general said, "Where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, a cannon can go." And on the morning of July 7th, Sinclair looked up at the top of Defiance, and it was studded with cannon. And he knew it was time to leave. That night, Sinclair sent his sick and wounded on boats south on Champlain, while most of his army marched down the military road toward Castleton. Approaching that settlement, Sinclair left a rear guard at Hubbardton under Seth Warner. Seth Warner is a Connecticut native, but he settles in Bennington. He is a Vermonter now. The British caught up and attacked Warner in early morning of July 8th. For 2 hours, the firing was heavy, and Warner launched a flank attack that might well have won the battle. But just as that flank attack was hitting the British flank, the Americans hear singing. And my God, a fresh German regiment is coming in from the north, singing a German hymn, a Lutheran hymn. We think it was "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And that flank attack on the other flank attack knocked the Americans off the battlefield, and they fled over Pitchford Ridge to fight again. Meanwhile, Sinclair gets his main force away to Castletown and Rutland. While all this was going on, representatives of the New Hampshire grants, what we now call Vermont, of course, were meeting at Windsor. What we now call, of course, the New Hampshire grants, we call Vermont, yes. Organizing a republic called Vermont. They wanted independence from the British, though the Continental Congress had refused to give Vermont statehood. While the Vermonters met, word came of Ticonderoga's loss. Concerned for the safety of their hands, their homes, the conventioneers hastened to depart. But suddenly a drenching thunderstorm exploded over the Connecticut Valley. The convention went back to work and adopted a constitution that included a pioneering article to abolish adult slavery, the first anti-slavery item in a constitution in the Western Hemisphere. The Republic of Vermont was born 14 years later to become the 14th state of the United States of America. Burgoyne brought his army to Skanesboro at the southern end of Lake Champlain, now Whitehall. There he settled into a very comfortable mansion owned by a wealthy Tory. Tories are locals who stay friendly to the king, you know. Philip Skane, his name was. Oh, and Skane had a great wine cellar, and Burgoyne loved the high life. So he stayed there and stayed there. The British commander soon decided to forgo the corridor's usual military route down Lake George and then overland to the Hudson River. No, he was going to take the narrow track through the woods that he'd have to do a lot of improvement on to get down to the Hudson. There's a theory today that he probably was going to improve that road to the benefit of Philip Skane, who had a lot of land in that area. Meanwhile, one of Burgoyne's German commanders, Friedrich von Riedesel, led a scout into Castletown, Pulteney, Clarendon, over into western Vermont. And he reported back to Burgoyne that the Connecticut Valley was said to be full of forage and fine horses. Burgoyne needed supplies. He needed forage. He needed horses. This was reported to Burgoyne, who somehow believed that 4 out of 5 residents of what is now Vermont were loyal to the king. Boy, was he wrong. With the Burgoyne scant miles from Vermont, 10 miles, an alarmed Ira Allen, who had been at the Windsor Convention, the major Vermont landholder and, of course, brother of Ethan, wrote to New Hampshire officials asking for help in the wake of Ticonderoga's fall. He issued the severe warning that if Vermont were lost, the frontier would suddenly be the Connecticut River. All of a sudden, the British could be right at New Hampshire's doorstep. The New Hampshire legislature quickly called on that state's best-known soldier, John Stark, veteran of French and Indian wars, and of Princeton and the Trenton and Bunker Hill battles in the Revolution. Indeed, Burgoyne had watched with admiration at Bunker Hill as Stark led his men in that bloody, bloody battle. General Stark quickly headed toward Vermont and soon had gathered 1,500 men at Charlestown on the Connecticut River, just across the river from Springfield, the fort at number 4. Meanwhile, at Skanesboro, 500 Indians joined Burgoyne and soon ranged south of the main force, spreading fear through the region. Word quickly spread of a general British advance, causing more and more Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont men to move toward the Hudson to fight the British. After 18 pleasant days at Philip Skane's house, that's Burgoyne, Burgoyne was finally on the move by July 24th. Now that's a good share of the summer gone, you see. He started down that narrow rutted track through dense and swampy woods. It had to be improved every foot. He had cannon with him. He had big wagons. 20 wagons carried his personal supplies, including a great deal of wine, table settings, tablecloths. Oh, he's an operator. That rutted track led 25 miles to the Hudson. Then it would be on to Albany, where 2 more British forces should meet him. Opposing Burgoyne were outnumbered troops commanded by an Albany gentleman landowner named Philip Schuyler, put in charge of this Northern American army by his friend George Washington. The overall American commander, Washington, was in New Jersey, watching a big British army in and around New York City. Where were they going to go? And following with concern events in the Champlain corridor. South of Skanesboro, the Americans did all they could to delay Burgoyne, felling trees, damming streams, ambushing. A frustrated Burgoyne wrote home to England that all he could hear day after day was chop, chop, chop. His army finally reached the Hudson. But there Burgoyne received the stunning news that no British army would be coming up from New York to help him. He was shocked, but he continued on toward Albany. As the march lengthened, the British supply line stretched and stretched. It actually went all the way to England. Boats from England down the St. Lawrence to Montreal or to the Richelieu and then down. They had to get supplies from England. Burgoyne was in a supply mess. He particularly now needed beef cattle. and more fresh horses. He's wearing his horses out. Surely recalling von Riedesel's report of bounty in the New Hampshire grants, Vermont, he decided to send an expedition to get supplies. He ordered Colonel Friedrich Baum, one of his Germans who spoke no English at all and had never commanded more than 3 or 4 dozen men in battle, to lead 500 German troops and go east with some Tories and Indians. Now here was Baum's orders. He was to do this in 2 weeks. Cross Vermont to Bellows Falls. Go down to Brattleboro, back across Vermont to Albany. 2 weeks. What an assignment. But on August 9th, Burgoyne heard of a lightly guarded supply depot located at Bennington. Orders were switched, and Baum was directed to proceed directly to Bennington only. He left Fort Edward on the Hudson on August 9th, with a force including Germans and Tory sympathizers that approached 1,000 men. His objective was now only 25 miles distant, just into Vermont, Bennington. As this was happening, John Stark and his 1,500 had come westward. Stark hastened 700 troops to Manchester, where Seth Warner and his main body, where Seth Warner and his survivors of Hubbardton waited. Stark and his main body crossed the Green Mountains in the shadow of Bromley Mountain and reached Manchester on August 7th. Back toward the Hudson, the going was slow for Baum's supply detachment. The weather was hot and rainy. It was August 14th when Baum reached the village of Sandcoik, now called North Hoosick, on the Willemsek River, 10 miles from Bennington. There his advance came under fire. That's a surprise. And Baum sat down to write a dispatch famously written on the head of a drum, to be sent back to Burgoyne asking for reinforcements. I need help. Stark had reached Bennington about the same time that this happened. About the same time that Baum had begun his march. And arriving at Bennington, Stark was greeted by reports of an enemy advance coming toward Bennington. He hurried 200 riflemen toward the Willemsek to investigate, and that's why near Sandcoik they ran into the front of Baum's column, and there was some shooting. In the brief fighting, an Indian chief was killed, which greatly upset his braves. Stark's men withdrew, and Baum followed the Willemsek toward Bennington, soon reaching a bridge that spanned the river some 5 miles short of the village. Stark had advanced his main force from Bennington and encamped his army on elevated ground looking toward the river and Baum's position. Stark's camp was within the new Republic of Vermont. It was and is still Vermont land. Greatly concerned that he was outnumbered, Baum ordered his men to dig in with his position centered at the bridge. He would wait on defense for reinforcements. Around his main position by the bridge, he posted 300 men, most on the west side of the river, but some in a cluster of houses on the other side. Let's take a look at this. This is a complex military position. Bennington's over here. The Willemsek flows like this. Like this. Here are the British. Here's Sandcoik over here on the Willemsek. They come like this and come to this bridge on the road to Bennington. Baum has his men dig in by the bridge right here, puts a few men on the far side of the river and some houses over here. He takes his grenadiers, some of his some of his artillerymen and German soldiers and puts them on a high hill behind his position, about 300 feet above them. And up there they build a three-sided redoubt with a cannon. Down here along the river, there's a ridge right over here, long ridge about 50 feet high, and he sends 250 of his Tories to build a fortification on top of this ridge called the Tory Redoubt. Over here, he puts some men at the base of this hill to protect the flank there, and he puts some men in this area where his baggage is stored. It's an interesting position. It's not a good idea to have your forces on two sides of a river. And that river is about as wide as the Ottaquisha right here. But still, you know, he's got the high ground protected. The real problem is they're too far apart. There's only about 1,000 men in his force. And the Indians are getting a little frightened. He's got maybe 150 of them, and they're getting pretty scared after their chief is killed. But this is basically the setup that Stark over here, here's the Vermont border right here. Stark's over here on higher ground. He's looking at all this. And that's what he's got to deal with. And he's up against professional soldiers. With Baum's force was a surgeon named Julius Wasmus. He recalled that after the brief fight on the 14th, he treated several wounded men, mostly Indians, then had a talk with the British officer, Captain Samuel Mackay. The captain said of the Americans, "Now they will become bold." He was right. Stark scouts and even spies had learned that considerably more about Baum and learned that, yes, Stark did have a lot more men than Baum. Always a fighter, Stark gathered his officers in camp right here. Actually right in here, on this side of the Vermont border, right here. He gathered his men and told that they would attack the next day, August 15th. But the day dawned with a heavy rain that lasted for nearly 24 hours, and Stark was forced to delay his attack. Skilled skirmishing went on in the downpour, and Baum's men got the worst of it. Another chief was killed, further taking the fight out of the Indians. In the woods and fields along the Woodstock, in this area, in here, right in through here, there was continuous fighting. Baum's men were learning that fighting Americans was a tough job. The Americans fired and ducked to another tree and fired and ducked to another tree and fired. The British, that's not the way you fight. You form a line and you march toward your foe. You're not doing it right, but they found it very difficult, and the Americans could shoot. Yet all the while, Baum's defenses, all this day of raining, they strengthen their defenses. This becomes more formidable. This becomes more formidable. Overnight, the weather cleared. August 16th came in warm and sunny. Stark now had some 2,000 men due to the steady arrival of local militia. Still, from the Hudson River 25 miles away, a relief force was on the way from Burgoyne, mainly mercenaries of the command of another German officer, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Bremen. Some 600 men had begun the march at 9 a.m. on the 15th. 2 brass cannons were coming along, though slowing the procession. Along the Woodstock, Stark had developed a complex battle plan that divided his army into 3 sections. He intended to strike from all sides at once, a very difficult thing to do on any battlefield. Late in the morning of August 16th, Stark sent New Hampshire's Moses Nichols with 250 men off south in a wide arc to come in behind the high hilltop Grenadier redoubt. Nichols went all the way down like this to come in up here. A similar number of men went to the north under a Vermonter named Herrick, coming in like this. Another force under New Hampshire commanders were sent down this way to attack the Tory redoubt. Another small force would take on this small German position at the foot of the hill. And Stark would lead the main attack directly against the position at the bridge. So you've got two 6-mile marches, left and right, one direct march of about a mile, and then about a mile and a half down to the Tory redoubt, and another mile and a half against this position. It is a complicated military plan. What Stark was attempting, among other things, was a double envelopment of his enemy, a classic battle plan that has seldom been tried in the history of warfare. Why? Because it's too complicated. It was keyed, obviously, to seizing this hilltop position. There's only 60 veteran soldiers in this redoubt up here. It's 300 feet above the battlefield, but Stark sent a total of 600 men after it. He figured if he had that, he's going to have the battlefield. It's a tough thing to pull off for the main reason that how do you want to launch your attacks at the same moment, but how do you do it with your troops so scattered? You do it by sound. The orders were for this group to fire first at about 3 o'clock. I should point out here, as I said, it's seldom been done successfully. One of the most famous double envelopment in the history of warfare was pulled off by Sitting Bull against Custer at Little Bighorn, almost 100 years later. Sitting Bull was a very well-educated human being, and he may well have known of Stark's plan at Bennington. I should note here, and I need to give credit here, there's a book by a Bennington man named John Lord, a remarkable study of the battlefield. It's got a hell of a title here. I almost went out of air reading it. Here I go. War over the Walloomsac, Land Use and Settlement Pattern on the Bennington Battlefield, 1777. It's a great book. Absolutely. I figured out Bennington from John Lord's book. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer. It's based on a map of the battle that was done by an English engineer named Durnford, who was in the middle of the battle. Indeed, he was captured after the battle. So Nichols and Herrick each had 6 miles to cover to get in position to attack the high redoubt. But they did it. The attack was slowed because Nichols got a little nervous down here and requested 100 reinforcements. So it wasn't until 3 o'clock that they were all ready to go, and Nichols let loose. He fired on the redoubt, and Herrick fires, and then Stark opens fire. It works perfectly. Everybody's firing. Well, the envelopment had worked. Way below, Stark heard the musketry and moved his large force against the British center at the bridge. To his left, the advance was well underway against the Tory redoubt. On the high hilltop, the American fire was so intense, my God, they vastly outnumbered this little position. Fires coming from everywhere. My God, those poor Germans. It was so intense that the defenders risked their lives just to peek over the top of their defenses, to shoot. There was one British cannon up there, and that was loaded up with anything that could find, stones, bolts, anything. And they were firing canister. But the Americans were quickly over the walls, and a vicious hand-to-hand, musket-swinging, slashing, slugging melee broke out within the redoubt. It was taken in some 15 minutes, and the surviving defenders ran downhill toward the river, closely pursued, falling and being captured, many shot along the way. Captain Joab Stafford, a Massachusetts man, led the American attack on the Tory redoubt. Here's your Tory redoubt. He comes in this direction. He forms a line of battle, he begins his advance, and then one of his men makes a discovery. There's a ravine that runs along the backside of the Tory redoubt, and from the top of this hill you cannot see it. While he faked an attack from the front, he sent most of his force down behind the redoubt. The Tories holding it are firing at this advancing line, which is staying pretty low, and all of a sudden there are soldiers coming over the back wall of their redoubt. This was over as quickly as the fight on top of the hill. The Tories were getting slaughtered inside their walls. They couldn't have held for more than 10 minutes. And soon many of them were off and running for their lives. Their conquerors picked them off as they ran across the field toward the river, and then shot them as they tried to swim the river or climb the steep banks of the river. The Tory redoubt, certainly within 20 minutes, had fallen. And Stark was moving against Baum's center with heavy fire. The position by the bridge held for a time, supported by the single cannon on the hillside. Baum's outnumbered men repelled 2 attacks, facing close-in fire, then they broke. A few troops from the Dragoon redoubt joined defenders on a flat by the river. They came down from the Tory redoubt, what was left of them, and formed a line of battle in this area. The men from the main position fell back here, and they held out for a short time, but it was a disaster. Baum was up on the hillside with his cannon when he was shot in the stomach by a musket ball. The Americans quickly captured him, and he was carried from the battlefield in absolute agony, put on a wagon and taken 2 miles to a house down the river where he died 2 horribly painful days later. At the height of the fighting, Stark, the seasoned veteran of many battles, said it was the hottest firing he ever heard, Bennington. And he'd been at Bunker Hill in the long British attacks at Ticonderoga in 1758. The battle they would call Bennington seemed to have been over rather quickly. All of the positions had fallen. Sparks' victorious men were jubilant. Their casualties minimal compared to their foes. A highly pleased Stark allowed for a bit of celebrating. And a good share of his men got more than a taste of rum. The party's on, boys. But the Battle of Bennington is not over. Not by a stretch. Marching toward the scene of the fighting was Burgoyne's relief force under Heinrich Bremen. The Germans advanced past Sandkoik and began meeting fugitives from the fighting, warning of a disaster ahead. Bremen always swore that he never heard the gunfire just 2 miles ahead. Now he's coming from right in here, you know, and here's the bridge over here. That's where he's headed. He's over here at Sandkoik. He's not more than 2 miles away, and he says he was never in any hurry. But he says he never heard the battle. Now, there are such things as acoustic shadows that happen on battlefields. One happened at Antietam, one happened at Shiloh, where armies, 4 or 5 miles apart can't hear each other. But we do know that Bremen and Baum didn't like each other. So maybe this guy has no hurry to come and rescue Baum. We don't know for sure. But coming were the reinforcements. A mile from the Loomsack Bridge, the Germans saw armed men ahead, and after some indecision opened fire. They weren't sure whose men they were. They immediately got return fire, and Bremen unlimbered his 2 new brass cannon here. The cautious Germans might have come on stronger, for the Americans were caught by surprise. Still, with his cannon blasting, a steady advance developed. Here comes the reinforcements headed for the bridge. Suddenly, the battle is up in air again. This is a lot of fresh men, 600 men. But Stark was responding to the crisis, sending troops out the Sandcoik Road to form a ragged line. Troops from all over the field heard the new fight and headed its way. But still, the Germans are driving them to that bridge, or that bridge. If they have that bridge, they cut everything in two. On came Bremen's regulars. The Americans give way within half a mile of the bridge. But soon along embattled Sandcoik Road, Seth Warner appeared. Form up and hold fast, he told the men. Warner had been in the fight since the beginning, had just seen his brother Jesse lying dead on the battlefield. Warner saw the crisis and he acted, assuring the hard-pressed troops that he would be back with reinforcements in 10 minutes. Warner rode back to the bridge seeking help. He didn't know who was back there, if anybody. And by the river, a half a mile away, to his great relief, he met his 140 Green Mountain Boys who had fought at Hubbardton, fresh on the field. The Americans are coming. They had arrived from Manchester the previous day and had come over from Bennington to join the fight. With them were 100 militia from Massachusetts. Warner had 240 fresh troops. It was like one of those cowboy movies I saw when I was a kid down at the Town Hall Theater. Just when you think the Indians have got it, here comes the cavalry onto the battlefield. Warner harried the fresh troops forward, and they hit hard. And more of Stark's men came into the new fight, and soon nearly a third of Bremen's force was shot or captured. The German colonel saw a hopeless situation, and as the bloody late afternoon became evening, he set his men into retreat. On and on through Sandcoik they went, as fast as they could, and on their way back all the way to Burgoyne along the Hudson, the Battle of Bennington was over. 20 of Bremen's relief force were dead, many more wounded. 140 were prisoners. Stark said that with a little more daylight, he'd have had the whole damn mess of them. In his fine little book on Bennington, Phil Holland puts Burgoyne's total losses at Bennington at 1,000, with 200 dead and 700 prisoners. He says that Stark numbered his American dead, listen to this, at 30. Though Holland suspects the figure's at least twice that, but still, 60 dead? Maybe it was a little higher than that. At Bennington, 480 prisoners were crowded into the town meeting house. 25 miles westward along the Hudson, Burgoyne welcomed Bremen's battered men back to the main force, praising their work. Then he resumed his march south, with Albany still 50 miles away. Soon Burgoyne got mad that the 1,500 men he still expected to join him at Albany coming along the Mohawk had been stopped well to the west. Burgoyne was on his own. There would be no help. As he led his now diminished army down the Hudson River, Burgoyne unintentionally paid Vermont one of its mighty compliments. Writing to his friend Lord Germain in London and reporting on the campaign, Burgoyne referenced the New Hampshire grants. Burgoyne said of that place he may not have known was called Vermont, quote, "It abounds in the most active and most rebellious race on the continent, and hangs like a gathering storm upon my left." Wow, that's Vermont. It is well worth noting that as the British Army had moved south, some of Burgoyne's marauding Indians had killed and scalped a young and lovely local girl engaged to a British soldier. The effect of Jane McCrae's death was apparently electric, even far beyond the Hudson River. More and more men picked up muskets and headed for the American Army, even from distant farms and villages. Jane McCrae. The American Army ahead of Burgoyne's grew and grew. In command of that American Northern Army was now Horatio Gates, replacing Philip Schuyler. And in his command was another general just hastened north by Washington, none other than Benedict Arnold. In early September, Gates placed his army on bluffs that overlooked the west side of the Hudson. Burgoyne comes down the Hudson, down the wide river, and now there is a bluff that sticks out almost to the river at a place called Stillwater, and the Americans are up here. It's only about 150 yards from the end of the bluff to the river. It was a great defensive position. The Americans had been there for a week getting ready for all this. By the time Gentleman Johnny's battered army arrived and faced the heights, Gates commanded at least 15,000 men up here. 50 volunteers. And he put them in earthworks overlooking the river valley. Burgoyne's force was now well under 7,000. The way to Albany was blocked. With nights turning colder and his supplies dwindling, it was mid-September when Burgoyne got his camp set up. Skirmishing began and was almost constant. On September 19th, seeking to break through Gates's defenses, Burgoyne launched an attack against the American left. The fighting went on all day. It was turned back by the long rifles of the Virginians and Benedict Arnold. The standoff resumed, as did the skirmishing. On October 7th, Burgoyne led his men in another try at the American left, this one a stronger attack. And once again, Benedict Arnold disobeys orders. He didn't like Gates, and went out to lead the counterattack, and he stops the British advance cold. A key British redoubt fell in this area, and Burgoyne was forced to retreat. So Gentleman Johnny gave up his try for Albany. In desperation, he turned his army to the north, headed back up the Hudson, bound for Ticonderoga's defenses, a long way off. He got only a few miles. About 5 miles up here. Waiting for him was a line of American soldiers that included John Stark and Vermont's Seth Warner. Burgoyne's way was blocked, and he was quickly surrounded right here at a place called Saratoga. He held out for a week and then asked Gates for terms of surrender. On October 16th, the British laid down their arms as American fifers struck up Yankee Doodle Dandy. Burgoyne's army was the first in all the history of the British Empire to surrender. Historian Russell Bellico summed it up as a victory over the best trained European troops at the hand of rural militia. Traveling with Burgoyne's campaign was a beautiful noblewoman, the Baroness Friederike von Riedesel, wife of the commander of the German troops. She kept a diary, and after Bennington, she assessed the Americans. Every inhabitant of the region is a good marksman, she said. The thought of fighting for their country and for freedom made them braver than ever. Saratoga became one of the mighty names in the history of the Western world. It has long been recorded as the decisive battle of the American Revolution, though the war would go on another 5 years in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the Carolinas, Virginia. Saratoga is seen as the turning point because it was Burgoyne's surrender there that caused France to come into the war. Their entry led to America's victory. It was in 1783 that England gave up in America. America was independent. But one wonders, looking back 250 years, historian Richard Ketchum tells us that when word of the victory at Bennington reached George Washington, he called it, quote, the great stroke struck by Stark. And a member of his staff wrote, there was a cloud in the north, but I really think matters in that quarter look well just now. I trust Burgoyne will be severely mauled. After Bennington, Washington believed that Burgoyne was doomed. What was really the Revolution's decisive battle? So perhaps the Burgoyne campaign had been the mortal wound, had received its mortal wound at Bennington. Indeed, neither day of fighting at Stillwater had produced the casualties suffered in Bennington's one day. If so, that old 360-foot monument that towers over the Vermont's old Bennington maybe isn't tall enough. And by the way, about all those old jokes concerning the Vermont battle fought in New York, well, Stark held his council of war in his camp, and from that camp he launched his attacks, including sending Nichols and Herrick on their long flank marches. Stark's camp was in Vermont. It's a Vermont battlefield too. And it was surely in that camp that Stark famously said on the eve of the battle, there they are, boys, the redcoats and Tories. We beat them today, or tonight Molly Stark sleeps a widow. Beat them he did at Great Bennington. Thank you for listening.